Okay, good morning, British and American culture students. The midterm is done. Congratulations. First of all, I know my hair is wild and that I'm unshaven, but let's just call this midterm Friday midterm style. I'm sure many of you who were doing the online exam didn't exactly dress up in a suit and do your hair and your makeup before you wrote your test. So you and I probably look similar, right? Anyway, overall, I'm really pleased with the scores so far. The median was very high, 23 out of 30 for the multiple choice. So that means people did well on the multiple choice. Now, you probably saw your score and there were two students who got perfect, 30 out of 30. And that's fantastic. But it said 30 out of 40 because I have to manually grade the last two questions where you have to write a paragraph. 59 students out of 65 submitted, and I already had a quick conversation with a student who unfortunately didn't submit in time. I don't know how many times I've told you, it's a computer program, okay? Please don't do this. Please don't submit at the last minute, I was literally watching the clock and 10 students submitted at 10:39, 50, 51, 52, and there were still forms coming in. Don't do that. You're giving me a heart attack, okay? 3 students managed to somehow sneak theirs in at 10:40. It's actually supposed to cut off right at 10:40, but there's a little bit of lag, okay? So the limiter cuts off like 3 seconds after 10:40. So 3 students got super lucky. The last 3, you know who you are. I'm not going to say your names, but I'll say your email addresses. cwsally@handmail.net and sun.dambi@gmail and halee0101@gmail.com. You 3 students are lucky you didn't get 0 because the form came in at 10. It's not supposed to, but just before it closed, you snuck it under the door. Don't do that again. Don't do that on the quiz. It's your fault, okay? One student was a couple seconds late, looked at the clock, said 10:40, tried to submit, it was closed. There's nothing I can do about that. So, sorry, 59 out of 65 isn't that bad. If you didn't do the midterm, that's a big chunk of your grade, but if you do everything else in the class, there's a chance that you can, certainly you can pass the class, but it's gonna be hard to get a good grade when you lose 15% off the top. So just keep going and doing your best. Do the assignments, don't miss any quizzes, and don't hand in any forms or assignments 5 seconds before they're due. That's just not a good idea. Something could go wrong. All the professors don't know what to do with you. When you say, I have a technical problem and I couldn't submit, what are we supposed to do? We don't know if it's the truth or not. So there's nothing we can do. So don't cut it that close. But just so you know, I can see your timestamps. I can see that you're logged in on the cyber campus. I can see the forms coming in. There are stamps. I can see what you're doing. I'm not watching you like, CCTV, but I'm the information, what you're doing online, I can see, okay? I know you're logged in. So you can't lie to me and say that you're logged in when you're not, because I have a record of it. So anyway, it looks good. Most of the students, we got a better turnout on the midterm than we've had on any quiz so far. I don't think there was any technical problems on my side, which will allow me to sleep tonight. And that's the way it is. Congratulations to the 2 students who did perfect on their multiple choice. I will have to go through all 59 midterms and check by hand what your scores were on the short answer, and I will release the scores and you'll get a score out of 40. So your email, when I'm done, I'm not sure how long it'll take, hopefully a week, but maybe a little bit longer. you'll get a score out of 40. So you'll get a second score. So your short answers will be added to your multiple choice, and that will be your midterm score. I also put a notice on the Cyber Campus so that I don't get 50 emails asking the same question. So this is Friday. We don't have a lecture today. So I'm going to upload this, and this is going to count as our Monday lecture, because actually today we had an exam. So you don't have to watch anything today. You don't have to log in again this week. But this will count as week 9's lecture. I have a really busy weekend. My sister-in-law is getting married. There's family stuff going on. So I'm just going to record today instead of Sunday. So we do need to finish up. You probably don't want to watch this video anyway, but some people might be curious about the midterm, so I thought I would upload it anyway. We need to just polish off the end of the 17th century in chapter 3, okay? And basically after the Civil War, Charles II, the son of the king who gets his head cut off, he comes back, and there's something called the Restoration, and the clock kind of rolls back, and it's more like King James and King Charles was. The parliament is kind of in the service of the king, but the balance is still a little bit tense. Charles is given a lot of money, but still overspends. He has a very, very lavish court. He probably the most interesting, most fun court since Elizabeth, at least, but maybe even longer than that. He had painters and he had musicians, and he liked art, he liked different types of art and architecture. But he spent a lot of money, and he was a little bit out of touch. Elizabeth used to go around and meet regular people, and made herself visible in the towns and traveled around a lot. And Charles liked dances and masquerades and performances and art galleries and beautiful gardens, but normal people wouldn't be able to see that. And, some people would have been able to pay a little bit of money to sneak in, but there was no museums or anything. These are all private collections. So the king has all this beautiful stuff, and he's spending a lot of money, but the regular people don't get to see it. So he's a kind of popular. He's definitely popular amongst the rich people. He spends tons of money, and they're gambling and they're dancing and they're listening to music and they're doing all these entertaining things which rich people like to do. But the average English person didn't get anything out of it. So Charles II, everybody's fairly content with him, but he's definitely out of touch. And again, he has money problems. But by the end of his reign, there is some concern that he's turning into a Catholic, and when he dies, he does get the last rites of the Catholic Church, and he, instead of choosing one of his daughters, Anne or Mary, to be the next ruler, he chooses his brother, James, and James is Catholic. So from 1685 to 1688, there's a Catholic king, and everything's going well. He was the Duke of York. James was the Duke of York, and New York was captured. It used to be called New Amsterdam, and the territory of New York, the colony, and the city, that's named after King James II. That's Charles II's brother. So, he had a military reputation, and he was famous, and he named New York after himself, the Duke of York. But his problem was religion. He wanted everyone to be Catholic, and he wasn't like Bloody Mary. He wasn't trying to kill everybody. He just favored Catholics, and he thought that if we allowed people to be Catholic, everybody would become Catholic. But he was wrong. Lots of people had different opinions, and just because he said, okay, everyone should be Catholic, just it's the best religion, didn't cause everybody to change. So, he chose people in his government, and the important positions in the military and in the country were given to Catholics because he liked Catholics. He was very biased. It's unfair, but he was Catholic and he wanted the country to be Catholic. This started to cause a lot of anxiety amongst rich people and poor people alike, that England would become Catholic again, and then it would be somehow attached to Louis XIV, who was making an empire of a French empire, continental empire. He was taking over territories all over the place. France was getting bigger and stronger and more powerful, and it's very Catholic. He was Catholic, so there was fear that King James was going to turn into a Louis XIV, an absolute monarch, an absolute Catholic monarch who was friends with France and would oppress the English people. So this group of guys called the Immortal Seven, they invite Mary, James's daughter, and her husband, William of Orange, who is the stadtholder of the Netherlands, to invade. They invite them to invade their own country. So he does. He brings a huge flotilla, many ships like the Spanish Armada, and James gets ready to fight them, but he doesn't really think that his daughter and his son-in-law are actually going to fight him. So he hesitates, and William manages to get over to England, and James loses his confidence, his will to fight, and his nose starts bleeding, and he ends up abandoning his own army and trying to run away and getting captured. And then he escapes to France. And then William and Mary, a Dutch man, and the daughter of James, Mary, Queen Mary II, they become king and queen. Now, this is important because, one, when they tried to stop William from coming, James's English fleet, again, there was a wind that blew them down the channel, which allowed William to land without being stopped by ships. And again, this Protestant wind, right? Just like the Spanish Armada, this God sends this wind, blows the Catholic English ships away, and allows William and Mary to land without any trouble. Protestant wind is back. Obviously, God favors the Protestant Englishman. And then they don't even end up having a battle. There's two armies. James's army is actually bigger, although William's army is better because it has more experience in fighting. They've been fighting against the French and other armies for years. So he has a veteran, experienced army, but it's smaller than James's army. But James just doesn't have any desire or confidence to have the battle, and most people don't want another civil war. It just happened 2 generations ago. People still remember how terrible it was, how many people died. So basically, James's army just slowly, defects or goes back home or, wanders away, and he ends up running away to France. And so there is no actual, it's a bloodless coup. It's an invasion, but there's no fight. So William just comes in and he says, I need money and I need soldiers because I'm fighting against Louis XIV, trying to stop him from taking over the Netherlands and making all of Europe a French Catholic empire. That's William's whole life. He doesn't really care about the English system or anything. So Parliament says, okay, fine. We'll make you king with your wife, who's English. You will co-rule together, but you will be the king and you'll be co-rulers. But Parliament is going to anoint you. So now Parliament's choosing the king. And this is now the second time, right? Because they invited Charles II back. Parliament chose that king, which was the son of the former king. So, okay. But this time they're choosing somebody from another country and saying, we want you to be our king. So who really has the power now, right? So they have, because William's focus is on fighting the French and his war in Europe, he's really just following whatever Parliament says, whatever they ask. They want him to do this, or they want to control this power, or want them to sign this document. He basically goes along with it because his main focus is raising armies and getting enough money. So this is called the Glorious Revolution because of, again, a king needing money and Parliament having the ability to get the money for him in exchange for, increased power for themselves. This is the point where Parliament becomes permanent. From 1689 until now, Parliament has met continuously without any breaks. It's amazing, right? This is over 300 years. So we're getting close to 300. It's 332 years. 332 years, unbroken meetings, and this is the constitutional monarchy of the United Kingdom. This is where it comes from. It starts from this. Parliament used to be summoned by the king, right? But now Parliament meets regularly. It's not dismissed and summoned here and there or whenever. Now it's always meeting regularly, and it's a sovereign entity itself. It can't be. The king can still delay Parliament and call elections, but he can't send it home for 12 years like Charles I did. He can't just say, okay, Parliament's done, everybody go home. Now Parliament exists permanently, and they have regular elections, and it goes this is the start of basically democratic government in England. Really, really, really important thing. Okay. The other thing I want to cover at the end of the chapter here. So the Glorious Revolution, the easy way to remember it, 1588, Spanish Armada, 1688, Glorious Revolution. Okay. Remember the 5th of November, that's Guy Fawkes Day, when they tried to blow up King James. That's actually the day that William invaded in 1688, was November 5th as well. So the dates really match up really nicely. Let's talk about how the culture of philosophy and intellectualism is developing. So the Renaissance started happening through, the recovery of classical learning in Italy, and through, the Reconquista, recovering, the Crusades brought texts back, and translations were made from Greek and from Arab, and they recovered all of this information, the ancient Greeks, all this knowledge, the Roman texts and the law books and the documents and everything. They have this rich, Western cultural history of philosophy and of knowledge that especially in Italy, and then the rest of Europe, France and Spain, and eventually up in the corner in England too, started to learn about all these things. Now, in the 17th century, they start to this idea of humanism, of things, being oriented around human beings instead of being oriented around the heavens, around divinity, but grounding things in morality and experiences in life and reason in the human being, continues to develop until they start to come up with things called like natural philosophy and the study of nature. And then you start to get people that are starting to become scientists, right? People that are starting to develop more complicated tools to observe the sky. Copernicus, Galileo, and there's Johann Kepler, all these people developing devices to see things, and navigation. They need to be able to calculate how to cross the ocean and where they are, look at the stars. They're calculating things and they're figuring things out. They're discovering things. This is the age of exploration. It's the age of enlightenment. So ideas are being explored, and the education comes from the Protestant emphasis on the Bible, but it starts to rapidly expand in many directions, right? The two people I wanted to talk about in my textbook, I should add more, but we'll just say one of the two most influential are John Locke, because of of his emphasis on natural rights and his concept of the tabula rasa, where every person is a blank slate, and that you can develop them into they can develop into in a positive way or a negative way, or they can develop into you can mold things, and there are certain inborn natural things that everybody possesses, but you can take them away. You should have them and you should protect them, but they can be taken away. He had some fundamental ideas. He mostly was into political, financial, and social philosophy. So he applied his ideas to the state. He thought that the ideal, balance, kind of like what the United States is modeled after, is the House of Lords and the House of Representatives, which is the House of Commons in the United Kingdom, and the king were like a sort of triangular balance. Representatives from the wealthy class that are appointed, representatives from the population, and then an executive who was, in England, inherited, but also could be chosen, right, by the people as well, right? So he came up with, England was a conservative country, and he's seen as sort of the father of liberalism, of freedom of the individual and natural rights. And his ideas have gone in many different directions, but in his day, his emphasis was on how humans had natural rights, and that the individual needed to be protected, and that all individuals fit into systems where there could be balance, and society should operate like that. He's very important in the creation of the United States and the way that England develops in the century after, after the Civil War, after the Glorious Revolution. John Locke has to run away, actually, because he's not popular amongst the royalists, and James II doesn't like him at all. But he is really aware of non-religious and fundamental social changes that are secular, that are not affected, that are human driven, and they're affected by social change and economic change. And this is kind of one of the most important aspects of Locke, is that he focused on reason and observation and on the human aspect, and his observations led him to make certain conclusions. And this, turns into an empirical type of study that is the basis for science. So the other guy in the book, who is even more significant to me, and most people know him even better, is Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton, of course, is the guy who came up with the famous formula to calculate gravity, but he did many other things. He was a legend in his own time. So he didn't just do gravity. He did experiments with light, and he came up with a method for calculus. And he was a genius, and he was recognized as a genius too. And he was elevated. And when other people from other countries visited, and they, met Sir Isaac Newton, of the Royal Society, he eventually became the chair of the Royal Society of Science, of Natural Philosophy in England. They didn't have that kind of stuff in most other countries. Scientists were not elevated to celebrity status, but he was a celebrity. Everybody knew who he was when he was alive. He was a superstar. He's the first Einstein. He's not the first Einstein. I guess there were, Greece had superstars too. There were Greek philosophers that were famous like this, but this is a scientist. This is a scientist who used logic and mathematics to develop theories and rationalized the world using a single formula. It's an incredible achievement, maybe one of the most impressive intellectual works of all time. Okay, So those are the two guys I want to focus on. There's kind of a social revolution. There's an enlightenment going on. There's a scientific revolution that's happening. These are slow revolutions, though, remember, not like the violent French Revolution or the peasants' revolt where they're trying to overthrow the government. These types of revolutions are slowly, gradually changing, and they're huge systems. We're going to be talking about the Industrial Revolution in a few weeks as well. So right at the end of this chapter, I snuck in a little part about Scotland, which I need to improve because it's too short. But basically, Scotland was the northern, part of Britain, and successfully defended itself for thousands of years against Romans, not as well against the Vikings, but they were never fully taken over by the Vikings either. They were colonized, but they defended themselves against the Angles, the Saxons, the Romans, the Celts, the Danes, the Swedes, the French, the Normans, etc., etc. Right at this point in time, 1688 is when the Glorious Revolution happens, and the wars are happening. Right before this, Scotland and England were kind of fighting each other in the Civil War. Sometimes Scotland was on Charles' side, on the Royalist side, and sometimes he was on Parliament's side. They just wanted to be Presbyterian, right? So they interfered a lot in the Civil War, and they were a big factor. But now the alliance that they used to have with France is sort of broken down because Scotland is not Catholic. Scotland is Protestant. They're Presbyterian. And France is super Catholic. So now, even though the Scottish and the English haven't gotten along very well for most of their history in a lot of ways, they have the same king, right? The Scottish king is the English king. And they just don't have a union of government. It's like, a CEO managing two different corporations. But now they're going to incorporate. So in 1707, they decide to form a union, which would become the United Kingdom of Great Britain, right? The kingdoms of Scotland and England cease to exist, and they become one United Kingdom called Great Britain. Now, the reasons for this, if you talk to any Scottish person, they will tell you, Scotland was in debt. There had been bad weather. Militarily, they're a smaller country. Economically, they were in big trouble. They tried to make a colony at Panama in the New World, and all those colonists died of disease, and they're undersupplied, and they committed a lot of resources to that, and the gamble, they lost all that money. So they were sort of in an economic, it was an economic catastrophe, and they were having problems with food, and the whole country was in a desperate situation. And so the English basically said, well, why don't we, and the English were not helping because, they were taxing the Scottish, and they were dominating ocean trade. So they were interfering with the Scottish attempt to trade internationally and to develop their own colonies. The English didn't want them to do that. So basically they helped create this crisis. And then the English said, we'll forgive all your debt. Don't worry about it. We'll pay all of the money that you owe. And we'll give you representation in the Parliament. And we will combine our kingdoms and form a new union and form a new kingdom where the government is in London and rules over the entire island. And they voted. The Scottish Parliament voted, and they voted yes, but they didn't really have much of a choice. There wasn't very many options there, so they did vote yes, but they didn't really have a choice. And since 1707, there has been a union between the countries, and they've been one country. Recently, they had a referendum about 7 or 8 years ago, maybe 2012, and they narrowly voted to stay. But now there's, the United Kingdom has left the European Union, and Scottish people think now maybe they should leave and rejoin. It's a very complicated situation, but basically for 300 years, Scottish and English people have been partners. Often English people have been the senior partners, but if you look at the names of inventors, you look at the names of philosophers, and you look at the names of leaders, there are hundreds of brilliant Scottish people. Alexander Graham Bell was Scottish, Adam Smith was Scottish, David Hume was Scottish, many of the inventors, engineers, Andrew Carnegie was Scottish, wealthy entrepreneurs, businessmen, intellectuals, philosophers, economists, scientists. There's so many Scottish people who have done such great things. And maybe the partnership provided the resources and the education for them to develop themselves. You could put that positive spin on it. Every country has their, every relationship has its positives and its negatives. So anyway, there's a short description of them, and there's a guy playing bagpipes there, of course, because bagpipes are a signature instrument of the Scottish. It's actually an instrument that used to be used in war, and my brother can play the bagpipes. They're very loud instruments, but once you get used to them, they're very interesting too. And that closes off chapter 4. So this will be the lecture. I'm going to post it this weekend, but that's just because I wanted to recap the midterm. So this is our Monday lecture. And later in the week, next week, I will post the second lecture for week 9, which will be the hard fork, the split between the British and the American. Finally, we're going to get into American culture because that's supposed to be half the course, right? So I'm going to talk about how the British and the Americans decide to go their separate ways. Okay, thank you everybody for doing your best on the quiz. Keep studying hard. It's not a quiz, it's a midterm, but it's over, and you have to learn from your mistakes and keep studying hard, and you'll be rewarded, I'm sure. So take a break, finish your assignment because that's due today, but after that, no homework for a couple weeks until we have our next quiz. So take it easy and enjoy, being relieved that you're done your test. Thank you for listening today, and have a good weekend.